Ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed my great pleasure to have on the Quantum Leap business show going all around the world to small business owners, giving them some ideas and some insights and some inspiration, a few tips and a little bit of knowledge as to what's going on. And I have my pleasure today to have on the show Fergus Shiel. Now, some of you may not know Fergus as a household name. Others certainly will when you certainly understand what the Fergus is involved with. So Fergus, welcome to the show. Tell me all about the ICIJ and what is your why as an organisation?
ICIJ stands for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. It's a not-for-profit reporting outfit based in Washington, DC, but with offices around the world. And what we do is we investigate global stories of public interest, and we're most famous for the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, and our recent publication, which came out on a matter of a week ago, the Pandora Papers.
And the Pandora Papers have already hit the news here with some highlights, probably in two areas, I think, Fergus. One is there was one feature on Tony Blair and how he'd legally, I might add, avoided about 300 grand in stamp duty on purchasing a property. But the other one was surrendering around, which was probably concerning to a lot of people out there, was the influence that a lot of people that have the ear of governments around the world were able to promote political donations under the carpet, as it were, and certainly without any degree of fanfare, to in return buy influence in a number of things. Can you just share a little bit about that for the people that didn't catch it?
So one of the things that has most grabbed ICIJ's attention in recent years is what's known as the revolving door. And this is people that work in professional organizations, accountants, lawyers, financial managers, who then go into government and then draft laws and then go back into the private sector. And we find this concerning because the dovetailing between the private and public sector often results in legislation that benefits the former company, so the private industry that the person has left before joining government. So Pandora Papers is a remarkable set of documents, more than 11.9 million documents, which show in rich detail the involvement of government officials, past and former high-level officials, and past and high-level politicians in the offshore world, and that included 35 former presidents and prime ministers, and more than 330 high-level officials, including ambassadors and generals. And what we argue in our stories is that this is indicative of the capture of the political class across the globe by the offshore industry, and the consequence of that is an unwillingness to tackle the negative aspects of the offshore industry, which include draining trillions of dollars from treasuries around the world.
So, and a lot of people are fairly familiar with that in offshore companies and whatnot in British Virgin Islands or in Panama, as one of the shows that were on a couple of years ago. People would argue, Fergus, that so far, and you might know, you obviously know a lot more than I do, having had access to the things, is there anything illegal that you see in there, or is it immoral, is the main issue? So
for us, John, the main issue is secrecy. It all comes back to secrecy. So it's not illegal to have an offshore company. It's not illegal to have a trust. But what we have discovered in project after project is that some of the people who use those trusts and shell companies are doing so for nefarious purposes. Not everyone, obviously. Many people are using them for international business and for entirely legitimate reasons. But what we strongly contend is that secrecy is problematic, deeply problematic, because it can, and we know it does, shield bad actors from tax authorities, from criminal authorities and from courts that are seeking compensation for their actions. And in Pandora Papers alone, we can see some of the world's biggest fraudsters. We know they're the world's biggest fraudsters because they've been accused and convicted. We can also see in Pandora Papers mafiosi. Again, we know they are mafiosi. They're not alleged mafiosi, they are mafiosi. We can see far-right figures, including neo-Nazis. We can see people that are involved in really sort of concerning pornography outfits. We can see people that have been involved in VAT scams out of the UK. We can see people involved in carbon scams. So there's a rich and colourful cast of figures in the Pandora Papers, as well as politicians, as well as business people, as well as celebrities. There include some of the, frankly, the most evil people on the planet.
And I'm guessing is that if people are following some of the percentages out there where the top 1% of the global wealth running around, I'd say there'd be a fair sprinkling in that category rather than the 99% of everybody else.
That's absolutely right, John. So there's more than 100 billionaires in there. And they're Forbes billionaires. There's probably more billionaires. So these are people that we were able to confirm through Forbes lists are absolutely billionaires. And some of those billionaires come from some of the poorest countries in the world, including Nicaragua. And so Nicaragua, there are many, you know, from Eastern Europe. There's, I think, if memory serves me correctly, about 35 or 40 of them are oligarchs. So these are people from Eastern Europe. And some are entirely legitimate business people, but others have been connected to things like the collapse of banks and have been connected to other really dubious business operations. And some come out of countries that are you know, on their knees. And then again, the issue here is around secrecy. We know again that the offshore world drains treasuries. We know that it causes bad governance. We know that it causes places like Angola, for instance, not to be able to meet their COVID crisis head on. What we would see in the Pandora Papers and previous project is basically that this system, this secretive offshore opaque system, is rigged in favor of the super rich, the uber rich, the powerful, and in some instances the criminal, at the expense of the rest of us, at the expense of your listeners, small business owners who, you know, pay a myriad of taxes, meet a myriad of red tape expectations. And at the same time as they're doing this, you have global corporations meeting few expectations and politicians, high-level officials, and others evading their responsibilities using the offshore world.
Yes, it's you know, if even a 20% of that money that was evading the current system, again, I repeat, legally, but perhaps not morally, then we would find funding for a lot of the projects here, even here in the UK, which is obviously a first world country.
Well, you see this, so there has been a push, and it's partly because of ICIJ's work by international governments. 136 international governments met a couple of days after we put out a message, a couple of days after we put out Pandora Papers, saying that they were, you know, they were pledging to have a threshold tax for global corporations of 15%. And that is partly as a response to Paradise Papers, which showed that international corporations such as Apple and Nike were evading, were shifting their profits around the world, sometimes to tiny palm-fringed islands, in order to reduce their tax, to minimize their tax. In Panama Papers, what we saw was, again, a cast of colorful characters doing something similar. The different thing, there are two things that make Pandora Papers stand out. The first one is what I mentioned before, and you mentioned before, which is the focus on enablers, the focus on law firms, accountants, and financial managers in this system, the way they prop it up. The second thing is it focuses really in a concentrated way for the first time on the involvement of US states in the offshore world. People think of the offshore world of the British Virgin Islands, of Belize, of Anguilla, these tiny places. But the offshore world is very much also the US, because states such as Delaware, states such as Wyoming and Alaska are increasingly becoming funnels for billions and actually trillions of dollars that are moving from around the world into these tiny states, sometimes tiny, barely populated states, to minimize tax.
So how did you determine what priority? This is, you know, as you say, nearly 11 million pieces of information here. Where did you begin to prioritize? And I bet there's probably months and years probably of digging yet to come to straighten it all out. And the other question is have you had any pressure from anybody in releasing some of these details?
So what we do when we get, we're very well equipped to deal with huge data dumps. We're one of the preeminent organizations in the world for dealing with it. We're a tiny organization, but we're very good at it. And what we do is when we get the data, we put it into a shared system called Data Share, where reporters around the world can access it. So that's the first step. And then ICIJ's data team indexes the data, so it's searchable by name. So you can go into it and look for a person's name. You can look for a person's passport details. You can look for a person's address. You can look for a person's company. Okay, and so that's the first thing we do. Then we break the information down into countries, and then once we've got into countries, then we can identify who from a particular country. And it could be a big country. In this instance, a majority of the people in the documents are from Russia. There are also a large number from Venezuela, a large number from Argentina, and a large number from the UK. So we break it up into countries, and then the reporters around the world can go into their respective countries and see what's going on. And the great advantage of what ICIJ does is that we partner with reporters around the world. So the task becomes easier, the task becomes more manageable. And in this instance, we partnered with 600 journalists in 117 countries. And here's the trick, John. The trick is that each of those reporters, because they're in their own countries, can identify more quickly what is important. So if you're in Australia, you can tell instantly who's the most important Australian. If you're in Benin or Gabon or Kenya or Honduras or Panama or Costa Rica, you can instantly tell. And that's the wonder of collaborative journalism.
So I think you've nailed that, and you've probably done what perhaps Julian Assange should have perhaps done with WikiLeaks at some point, or is that a different scenario?
What Julian Assange did is completely different to what we do. So we don't dump documents on the internet. That's not what we do. We are journalists. We operate totally in the public interest. We do not reveal documents about people that are just of no consequence. If your next door neighbor is in Pandora Papers, we won't be reporting on them. Yeah, unless they're a figure of public interest, unless there's a public interest in reporting on them, we won't do it. So, and we also do things like we redact personal information. So you will not find bank account details, you won't find passport details, you won't find home addresses. We take it all out because our purpose in this whole exercise is to do journalism that matters. Journalism that focuses on issues such as transparency, global inequality, and corruption. We are not doing it for any other reason. We're not doing it to big note ourselves. We're not doing it for salacious reasons. We do it because we think it's important. And we know it's important because already governments around the world have sought access to documents, and governments around the world have called inquiries into it. We know it's important because the Chilean president is now facing impeachment because we know it's important because the Czech voters thought it was important enough to dump their government. So we take very seriously our public interest obligations. We take very seriously the fact that what we do is complex, it requires rigor, it requires discipline and honesty in everything that we report. Everything we report is factual, and we have had no accusations of inaccuracy in this project at all.
Yep. And I think it's refreshing to a lot of people that watch the news, me included, who's been fairly vocal in a lot of media outlets nowadays, trying to create news rather than report it, and develop it into almost social issues of the day rather than the news program. Whereas this was truly newsworthy.
That's right. We don't do opinion pieces. We do news. So we do investigative journalism. That's our purpose.
Yep. And from what you're saying, just a quick one here. They're not illegal, but what should be done in your? Have you got any opinion on tax havens as an entity? Yeah,
so it's not illegal, but it can be used for illegal purposes. I don't want to let tax havens I don't want you to think that I think tax havens are perfectly fine. I don't. So the problem with tax havens is they're secretive, and because of that secrecy, they are used for really, really bad purposes. And one of the worst things ever created was the shell company, because the shell company allows an individual or a corporation to hide their ownership of something. Now, some governments around the world have tried to tackle this and try to improve transparency, and they've brought in registers of owners. But many of them have brought in registers of owners that aren't publicly available. And so that's of no use whatsoever. So what needs to be done in the interests of a fairer, more just world, and a world which tackles corruption and criminality and tax evasion, is for the veil of secrecy to be cast off by these providers. They should not be secretive. It should not be secretive. Everyone should be able to know if their politicians own companies. Everyone should be able to know if multinational corporations are seeking to minimize their tax. It's just very basic. And there have been many suggestions of how to tackle it. And one way is to impose a tax on all offshore companies, a 3% tax that goes up, and so long as they remain secretive. I do not think that the offshore world needs to exist as it does. I do not think that the secrecy is appropriate. I know from our work that it causes immense harm to countries and individuals across the planet. Vast harm, year in, year out.
Yep. And just finishing on this topic is with political donations. Someone said that there's, 6 or 10 lobbyists for every senator in the United States, and I'm sure there's some number that represents that. So if a lot of this money is funding government and it's secretive, it certainly lends itself to doubt in the eyes of the voter, because the political system, as we know, it's gone through some pretty much big upheavals in the recent times, hasn't it?
Oh, it's a huge problem. Lobbying is a massive problem. So the reason the offshore industry continues to prosper is because of lobbying. And political donations globally are an issue. You can see in the UK, where you are, I think, John, you have an issue with large amounts of money coming from Russia into the Conservative Party, and the Conservatives defend this on the basis that governments need to, or sort of political parties need funding, and this is good for democracy. But it surely isn't good for democracy if the money is being poured into the party, and that money comes through secretive offshore accounts. It just can't be in the interests of anyone.
Yep. And I'm sure it's more than just one party.
Oh yeah. So don't get me wrong for a moment. This is not a go at the Conservatives. There's ICIJ is completely non-aligned politically. We can see the same thing happening across the planet in relation to all political parties. So in the Pandora Papers, some of the political figures that are using the offshore world are liberal. Some of them are centrist. Some of them are right-wing. Some of them are extreme right-wing. It's universal. This is we are completely non-denominational when it comes to politics. We are not a political organization. We are out to we focus on things for journalistic reasons at all. Yeah. But the concern is that it's universal when it comes to politicians. Their support of the system, their unwillingness to tackle the system, their previous unwillingness to tackle the system. We have seen some ground shifting, and we have, as I said, we're pleased to see some governments paying attention to what you've done. It was quite entertaining when Pandora Papers came out in Pakistan to see the generals, who are very politically powerful in Pakistan, come out and a day ahead of publication to say that they're calling for Imran Khan to step down because he was in the Pandora Papers. He is not in the Pandora Papers, but there are some generals. And so you could see the generals reversing swiftly a couple of days later. But you know, that's sort of a small example of the issue across the world, which is that people of all political persuasions are involved in the offshore world. And unfortunately, their involvement comes at a great cost for the rest of us.
Yep. How does that impact on fake news? I know Donald Trump made that pretty much a catched cry, but was it part of the problem? Has it been around since, you know, people were in caves? Or, you know, how can the reader gain some confidence in the authenticity of what they're reading or viewing on social media and other media formats?
Oh, fake news is a huge problem everywhere. One of the things with Pandora Papers, Ken, is that there are quite a few publishers in the data, and so it's not just politicians that are involved in the offshore world; it's also publishers. Fake news is a huge problem. What we think the antidote to fake news is the kind of work that we do, which is rigorous, authentic, vigorous, fearless, entirely fact-based, fact-checked, and we have seen that as a consequence of our work there, it produces huge impact. And we hope that this inspires people to not give up on journalism, to remain faithful to those outlets, those international outlets who often partner with ICIJ, who believe in credible journalism and pour their hearts and souls into it.
Yep. It's almost like a blockchain of journalism in your organisation, because you have so many in the system. It's almost that, you know, when many people agree, then it helps with authenticity.
Oh, it's very helpful for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is impact. So it's not one hammer banging on a wall, it's hundreds of hammers banging on the same wall. So that's good. But it's more than that. Journalists around the world are under continuous threat. You know, it's a very serious threat. There are journalists currently from Venezuela that are living in Colombia because it's unsafe to be in Venezuela. There's journalists from Nicaragua that are in Costa Rica because it's unsafe to be in Nicaragua. During this project, some of our partners in Russia, about 17 journalists, left Russia because it was unsafe for them to be there and scattered to Prague and to Riga. Journalists in Malaysia and Kenya and elsewhere came under extreme pressure. Panama, Bolivia, and this is universal. In Mexico, journalists get murdered. In Australia and Ireland, journalists get threatened with court action all the time, to the point where it's silencing. So what ICIJ does by bringing together journalists from around the planet is it manages to overcome those problems. So there's bravery in numbers. That's the first thing. So people are more brave. The second thing is that we can actually have a story that won't get published in one country, published in another. And we see this repeatedly. So we see a reporter in, for instance, Peru publishing something that can't be published in El Salvador, or something in Honduras publishing something that can't be published in Nicaragua, or somebody in Kenya publishing something that can't be published in Ghana. And that gives you a protection and inoculates you against threats in individual countries, and allows you as a collective to achieve far more than you would otherwise in the face of legal action, in the face of intimidation, and sometimes, sadly, in the face of violence.
Yep. So Fergus, you know, you're born in Ireland, and as a young Irish lad, ended up in rural Australia, of all places. And then you spent 20 years with the Melbourne Age as the editor. How did that journey all come about? Can you give us just a quick recap? Yeah,
so I can remember the day I was with my girlfriend. I was in Dublin. It was cold and wet. It was a Friday night, and we were walking down O'Connell Street, which is the main street in Dublin. And to get out of the rain, we went and saw Crocodile Dundee. And I thought, geez, this is great. What a country. This is the place for me. And so I was working in a small country town in the north of Ireland, northwest of Ireland, and things were getting very hairy. There were, you know, soldiers on the street. There were bombs on the border in Fermanagh. And I just thought, I need to get out. I've had enough. So I got a job in, I flew to Sydney without a job, and I started working on construction. I worked for construction companies, and then I worked in the cinema, and then I eventually got a job as a reporter in Sydney. Then I went back to Ireland briefly, then back to Melbourne and on to Ballarat. And from there, I went step by step till I became one of the editors at the Age in Melbourne, which was a fantastic place. I worked with amazing journalists there, like Michelle Grattan and Michael Golden and Patrick Smithers. There's so many people at the Age that I hold in such huge regard and fondness. And then from Melbourne, about 4 years ago, I was asked if I would come to DC to run the DC office of the ICIJ, and it just seemed like a good thing to do. It seemed like an interesting to do, and so with my wife and my 3 tiny kids, we moved across the world. I think our baby was 6 months old, and we pushed a stroller in the snow for 6 months because we didn't have a car. And DC is fantastic. Love it, absolutely love it. Have a great time. ICIJ is fantastic, does great work. And it's been an amazing change. And I've been immensely fortunate in my career, immensely fortunate to work in such great places as the Ballarat Courier, the Age, AAP, and now ICIJ.
Yep. So Fergus, you're a Liverpool fan, from what I'm told, and Liverpool were obviously involved in the European Super League proposal, and everybody, was up in arms over the fact that there was money involved, which to me was a bit weird because money is the whole thing behind the Premier League, which is just that. And then we've just seen Saudi Arabia take over Newcastle. What are your thoughts on that from a fan's perspective, knowing what you know now with where all the money perhaps comes from?
Yeah, it's interesting, John. So with Pandora Papers again, so there's one of the things it connects to is FIFA Gate, which is a big scandal in Latin America involving football. We've seen football leaks, which came from Rui Pinto, who was a leaker out of Portugal. And Rui Pinto actually gave us some documents. We didn't know it at the time, but it gave us Luanda Leaks, which revealed huge corruption in Angola and the spiriting of hundreds of millions of dollars out of that country. I think what I've learned is that the world is not as most people think. The world is not a good and honest place. The world is corrupt to its bootlaces, and football is no different. And so the Super League thing was dispiriting, but it was if I absolutely love Liverpool. I can't tell you how much I devote my life to Liverpool. I love them to bits. I followed them since I was a little kid. My brother follows them. All my family follow them, except for my dad, who follows Everton. But you know, I do so with my heart, not my head. I realise that football is not it's not a good world. The Newcastle thing is really, it's horrific. It's awful. Manchester City's ownership is awful. Chelsea's is not much better. And there's clubs all around the world that are, really desperately conflicted. There was a guy came in to see me the other day, John. This is a small thing about football, and he is from Moldova, and he's an anti-corruption guy from Moldova. His name is Sergei Toflat. He's a great guy. I really like him. I've been dealing with him for years. And he told me, he came in and he sat in the chair and he started to chuckle. And I said, Sergei, why? Because we were talking about football. And I said, why are you laughing? And he's a very serious guy, but really. And he said, Transnistria, because we talked about Transnistria, which is tiny sort of, it's not really a country. It's a kind of sort of a country that sits next to Moldova. And he said, the Transnistrians got into the championship, European Football Championship. And he goes to me, Fergus, how does that happen? There's a question for you, John. How does a country that has no money, that sits next to Moldova, produce a team that gets into the European Championship? I'll leave that for your listeners to decide. But,
I think most people are getting on the same page. Fergus, the old adage that good news never makes a paper sell. Is that still true? And why is there a psychology behind that if it is true?
Oh, there's that old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. I don't think it's necessarily the case. I think a good news story can sell. I do. But it has to be a variety of news, good and bad. I think what is clear is that more and more papers are distancing themselves from news altogether, and they're just substituting opinion. And I think that is what keeps social media abuzz. But I think it's a very poor decision on behalf of publishers. I think it's part of the reason why people have lost faith in journalism. I think it's part of the reason why people have given up buying newspapers. I would hope that the tsunami of opinion recedes to at least allow more solid news to take some share of papers back, reclaim it.
So how can society become more positive? The whole reason I started these Quantum Leap shows was that I was just sick to death of people moaning and complaining about COVID and Brexit and the weather and anything else that no one had any control over. How can people become more positive and find some solutions rather than just moaning about it? And what would be your number one problem globally that you'd have a solution for?
I think people have to be kinder. That's the first thing. I think one of the reasons ICIJ is successful is because it's a kind organization. The only way you can get 600 people to work together for across different languages and different countries for 2 years is to be kind. I think there's a complete lack of kindness, and with greater kindness comes greater patience. With greater patience becomes greater opportunities to resolve things. I think there's a huge dearth of kindness in the world. I think what solutions? It's difficult, isn't it? It really is difficult.
What do you think of things like a KYC document, a know your client or know your customer document for social media profiles, as an example?
Yeah, I do think that there is a real issue with social media and cruelty and bullying and trolling. I think across, I think ego is a huge problem. I think people now value ego above everything else, you know. So, and that's a generational thing, but it may be changing. It may be changing. We've seen huge stratospheric leaps forward that we should be optimistic and more optimistic and better and happier about. So yeah, the Me Too movement produced great change, really great change. I mean, that's something that in our lifetime, in our recent lifetime, that has produced a huge improvement in the lives of women. You know, that is a fantastic thing. We should be really happy about that. Black Lives Matters, again, it was a sea change. I'm not saying that these things don't come with conflict and with, they don't come with, you know, a sense that of sudden change that can be difficult to navigate. But equally, I think we should be really, really pleased to know that we have lived through these momentous changes, and they are changes for the better. And I do think in terms of global inequality that we are seeing something similar. And in terms of climate change, I mean, even in the last few days, we're seeing for the first time, really, a serious intentional effort on behalf of governments to deal with it. And now it's only the very few countries that are outliers on it, including, sadly, for our sake, John, Australia, which is, you know, the last man standing, really, with a piece of coal in its hand, and Japan. So there's lots of reasons to be optimistic, I guess is what I'm saying. There are reasons to be pessimistic too.
That's possibly a good place to leave it. So, but before we do, what's next? Anything exciting on the agenda that in your neck of the woods?
It's always excitement at ICIJ, John. But we never reveal what we're up to. But,
well, I just thought I'd sneak one in at the end there to see where we got to. So, Fergus, Shiel, it's been my absolute pleasure and delight to have you on, and I'm sure people will get some lovely insights into the big end of town, and there's a lot of people that I'm sure would be loving to sit on your shoulder and see what's going on with a lot of this stuff. So we'll look forward to a continuation of what's happening with great interest. So on behalf of everybody on the show today, thank you very much for giving up your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. It's great to chat to you and to your listeners, and yeah, all the very best to you for the future.